Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. It's a great Australian pastime to tip buckets of, well, shall we say, criticism on Australia's federal system. How often have you heard people say that we are over-governed with 3 levels of government? That it's all about duplication and a waste of money and totally broken. That we should have one single central government and uniform laws. In this video, I'm doing something a bit different from what I normally do. Usually I just explain what the Constitution says or a court says or what the law is without actually giving my own opinion on it. In this particular occasion, I'm going to do something different, and that is I'm going to give an opinion, and it's a very controversial opinion because most of you, I can guarantee it, will disagree with me. However, I hope that if you actually watch to the end, you might conclude, begrudgingly, that maybe she has a point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that a federal system of government is actually a good system of government for Australia, and that federalism as a system of government is actually a very efficient one. Now, sure, we could operate our federal system much better, much more efficiently. There's plenty of ways in which we could improve it. But it's still better for Australia than a unitary system of government would be, at least in my view. Now, I'm going to start here with a little bit of myth busting and then move on to the benefits of federalism. First, are we over-governed with 3 levels of government in Australia? And the answer to that is no. Most democratic countries have at least 3 levels of government and many have 4. Amongst OECD countries, which are the ones that are most comparable with Australia, a 2019 OECD report records that those countries with only 2 levels of government were small in geographical size and/or population. They comprised 2.1% of the geographical area of the OECD and 2.7% of its population. This means that at least 97% of people living in OECD countries have at least 3 and sometimes 4 levels of government. Countries with more levels of government than Australia, that is 4 levels of government, actually comprise 1/3 of the OECD in total area and around half its population. So no, Australia is not an outlier when it comes to levels of government. Actually, we're right in the middle. But why do countries that are not federations, because not all OECD countries are, why do those countries end up having so many levels of government? Because people want local car parks and roads and drainage and libraries and planning issues, the things that are close to home, literally, physically close to home, dealt with by people in their own community who understand their own concerns and needs. Hence, they want a local authority in each community which is able to decide upon these matters. Things like education and health and policing, however, require greater economies of scale to be managed efficiently and effectively. So these tend to be dealt with at a regional or a state level. This still accommodates different wishes and needs of different geographical locations, but it does allow for functions to be managed in a manner that's less burdensome on the taxpayer, which is a good thing. Other functions, such as defence, immigration, foreign affairs, need to be dealt with at the national level. The principle that's generally used to allocate functions amongst levels of government is known as the principle of subsidiarity, and that is that functions should be allocated to the level of government that's closest to the people that can effectively perform those particular functions. The greater the decentralisation of a country, including unitary states, the more economically efficient the country is, according to the OECD. Geography is another indicator of why Australia needs at least 3 levels of government. If you look at a map of the world, every country with a land mass that's as large or larger than Australia is a federation, except for China, which is a quasi-federation. And every one of those countries has at least 3 levels of government. There's a good reason for that. You can't properly manage a country of that size from the centre with 1 or even 2 levels of government, which is why no country does it, and we couldn't either. The notion that Australia would be better off if we just got rid of 1 level of government, which I appreciate is a popularly held notion, is in reality just fanciful. The next myth is that federalism is an economic drain on the country and a less efficient system than a unitary system of government. The evidence shows that the opposite is true. Now here I'm drawing on a paper that I wrote with an economist who's responsible for the economics parts of it, Professor Glenn Withers. Now this was back in 2007, so the statistics in it are a bit old and I haven't tried to update them. It's called Australia's Federal Future, and I'll include a link to the paper in the description box for anyone who's interested in seeing the stats and the various sources for them. Now in that paper, drawing on statistics including from the OECD, it recorded that in the last 50 years around the world, federal economies have consistently outperformed non-federal economies. And the more decentralised the countries become, the better their performance. Without internal competition, governments do tend to become inefficient, overstaffed and expensive to run, just as monopolies do in the business world. Comparing Australia against the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom and New Zealand in terms of the cost of government as a share of GDP, the report found that the 2 unitary countries, the United Kingdom and New Zealand, had the most costly governments, while the 3 federations, the United States, Australia and Canada, were in fact the cheapest to run. And this is a statistic that actually really blew me away when we were preparing that report. And that is, according to OECD figures, the proportion of the workforce that was comprised of public sector workers across all the levels of government was greater in unitary states than in federations. Equally, public sector spending as a share of GDP was much higher in unitary states than in federations. In brutal terms, if Australia were a unitary state rather than a federation, it would most likely have more public servants overall, costing more taxpayers money and working less efficiently. Now, what about the positive benefits of federalism? Are there any? Well, yeah, there actually are. There are a few, so let's go through them. First, federalism operates as a check on concentrated power. And this is particularly important in a country like Australia, which doesn't have an entrenched Bill of Rights. Okay, so federalism is an important way of protecting rights. So you know the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, under a federal system, power is distributed across levels of government so that no government has full power to do what it wants. That's important. Would you really want a single federal government with all power, especially if it's controlled by whichever side you don't like? The fact that governments often have to negotiate intergovernmental agreements to achieve common aims pushes them to take more reasonable and justifiable positions, which they can then use to persuade others to get their support. Human rights advocates, such as the former High Court Judge Michael Kirby, support federalism because it protects the individual from the excesses of an unrestricted government. Even the Business Council of Australia has supported federalism, pointing out that the exercise of power becomes contestable when more than one government is involved. As a consequence, governments are under greater pressure to defend their decisions publicly, leading to more moderate and considered outcomes. Transparency International has also previously found that OECD federations have on average higher levels of integrity than OECD unitary states. And that's because under a federal system, power is dispersed and is more open to scrutiny and comparison by other jurisdictions within the country, resulting in less corruption overall. The second benefit of federalism is that it provides greater diversity and choice. People will sometimes support one party in a federal election because they prefer its approach to certain national issues, but then they support a different party at the state level because of its policies in relation to particular state issues. If there is just one unitary government, all issues are bundled into the one election and the choices for the people are more limited. Federalism allows for choice and diversity amongst jurisdictions as well. If you think that the school curriculum in your state is poor, or that the support for your disabled child in public schools is insufficient, you can actually move to another state that better suits your needs. People can and do vote with their feet in a federation, as do businesses in deciding where to set up. Many people say that there should be one uniform school curriculum across the country. Now, I have to say, I have complete horror at the idea of that. It allows the curriculum to be hijacked for ideological purposes, with every single child across the nation being taught the same propaganda from the same books, with no diversity of choice and no meaningful comparison from other jurisdictions. Minimum national standards are fine, but we need to allow the states to be free to build on them and allow the teaching of different subjects and specialisations. A state with a large mining industry, for example, that needs geologists might well want to teach geology in schools. That diversity in the people across the country in terms of what they've learnt at school is actually really valuable for Australia. Under a federal system, there's also diversity in the location of our major institutions. They're not all situated in Canberra. We have state capitals, which all have major museums and libraries and art galleries and universities. In comparison, in a unitary state like France, the major institutions are all concentrated in Paris, and people have to move to Paris if they want to advance their career. Federalism also allows governments to fill a policy gap. When the Commonwealth Government was not prepared to deal with climate change, many states stepped into the gap and implemented their own reforms. Equally, if a state fails to address an important issue, well, sometimes the Commonwealth can come and fill that gap. The third benefit of federalism is that it allows policies to be customised to meet the different needs of people in different parts of the country. Australia's geographical size means that there are significant differences in climate, geography, demographics, culture, resources and industry. One size does not fit all, and bureaucrats in Canberra do not know what is best for places that are completely remote to them. Now, a classic example on this was the decision of the Commonwealth Government when it controlled both the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory to be terribly efficient by using the plans for Canberra's Woden Hospital as the basis for building the Royal Darwin Hospital in the Northern Territory in the 1970s. So they actually built a hospital in Darwin that was equipped to deal with cold, frost and even snow, rather than one equipped to cope with the tropics. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody also pointed out that the hospital structure was not appropriate for local Aboriginal people. Later extensions to the Darwin Hospital that were planned in Darwin under the Northern Territory government, when self-government was established, were much better suited to its climate and its people. Federalism accommodates the different preferences of people in different parts of the country. If the people of Western Australia do not want daylight saving or object to poker machines, then their wishes can be respected. Not everyone thinks the same or wants the same thing. Federalism recognises that. The fourth advantage of federalism is the ability to compare and improve. The comparison between the performance of states and territories means that there's a constant process of improvement. If a state premier sees that another state is performing better in hospital efficiency or NAPLAN educational results, he or she tells public servants to find out why the other jurisdiction is doing better and to pick that up and improve upon it. Now, I know that personally because I actually got that call once when I was working for the New South Wales government. If there is just one federal government with no relevant comparator to judge it against, then there's no embarrassment and blame and nothing there to spur improvement. The fifth advantage of federalism is that it's really a laboratory which allows for change on a smaller scale. If a reform proves successful, such as compulsory seatbelts or hospital case management or environmental protection, it can be picked up by other jurisdictions. If it's a failure, think WA Inc., then it doesn't bring down the whole nation. It can be isolated to one particular state. Many of Australia's electoral law innovations commenced at the state level, such as votes for women, compulsory voting, proportional voting, and lowering the voting age to 18. Anti-discrimination laws also began at the state level. Bryce once compared a federation with a ship that has watertight compartments. He said that when a leak is sprung in one compartment, the cargo stored there may be damaged, but the other compartments remain dry and keep the ship afloat. Federalism gives the country as a whole a chance to judge how successful an innovation might be, like a Charter of Rights or the recent South Australian proposal to ban political donations, before deciding whether it should be adopted across other jurisdictions or nationally. Now, having gone through all of that, you will then rightly point out that we are not living in nirvana and that there are real problems with the federal system, including duplication and blame shifting. Well, that's true. But the point is that this is largely because we don't run the federal system as well as we should. It's a reason for improving the federal system and how it operates rather than ditching it. Could you get rid of much of the duplication and blame shifting? Well, yes, you could. Most of it results from the poor federal financial system that we have. The Commonwealth raises most of the tax and the states have most of the spending responsibilities. So the Commonwealth has to pass money on to the states, but then it decides that it should restrict or monitor how that money is used because, hey, it's money, it collected the money. And that creates a vast and unnecessary bureaucracy to control all this. So you have departments of education and departments of health, which you don't really need at the federal system where none of them runs a school or a hospital. Now, you can multiply the examples, but it could be fixed if there were political will to do so. Second, you may well point out that uniformity is important for certain things, like rail gauges. Okay, we all get that. Yes, you are right. The key to a good federal system is to work out what types of things need to be uniform and where it's better to allow choice, diversity, competition and innovation for all the reasons that I've just given. Then you either allocate those things that need to be done uniformly to the Commonwealth or you improve the ease of mechanisms to cooperate to achieve that level of uniformity. Now, none of this is rocket science, but the political will to undertake reforms that could vastly improve Australia's economic efficiency is just not there. Third, there are people who will say we should ditch the states and local government and replace them with 50 or more regions. Now, in my view, again, just my opinion, but I think this would be the worst of all possible worlds because you take away the local input for what happens closest to you in your community. You'd either lose the benefits of economies of scale by having 50 or so different school systems and hospital systems and police forces, making it much more expensive to run, or you'd have to centralise those matters to the national level so that everything about them would be decided in Canberra. Regions would still have to have their operations funded, but setting up 50 different tax systems would again be inefficient. So it's likely that all funding would again come from the centre, exacerbating the existing cost shifting and buck passing. Even if regions had their own tax systems, only those regions which had major cities in them would actually be able to raise enough money to survive, with the rest of them relying on money having to be redistributed from other regions or the Commonwealth to keep them afloat. So the problems of lack of accountability and blame shifting would actually get worse rather than better. The benefits of federalism, such as competition and innovation, would be harder to achieve under such a system because of the smaller population bases of most regions. Transaction costs in servicing a small population would be higher, and it would be unlikely that there would be a bureaucracy of sufficient size and depth in order to be able to produce innovative policy. As for intergovernmental negotiations, look, it's manageable with 6 states and 2 territories, but would be just impossible to manage with 50 or so regions. The bottom line is that it would be more expensive, less efficient, and the people would lose most of their influence over local matters if you took that system of 2 layers of government, 1 national, 1 regional. And that's why most countries opt for 3 or 4 levels of government, not 2. Well, that's my view, and I'm sure many of you will disagree, and that's absolutely fine. It's just an opinion, and people are entitled to have them. But just try to do so in a civil way if you're writing in the comments, because there's more than enough anger in the world at the moment, and really none of us needs to contribute to that. And if things get too nasty, as they did in relation to the last video, then I'll have to turn the comments off, which is a pity. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.